Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Very warm good morning to everyone. I hope all of you are doing good. It is 10 a.m. meaning that it is time once again to begin analyzing the Hindu newspaper for the day. I hope all of you are doing good, and today we'll be discussing some of the most important topics from the Hindu newspaper. Those specifically who are appearing for this year's prelims examination, I hope that your preparation is going right on track. And I really hope that these analysis is helping you actually gain a lot of knowledge about the prelims facts as well. Let's see what are topics that we'll be discussing today. But before that, reminding you, we have a very important crash course for all of you that is going live on YouTube. As you know, every single day at 7 p.m. we have these classes of the English crash course where we are discussing topics in the form of question and answers that have a probability of being asked in this year's prelims examination. It's 21st of May, so today will be the second class of geography. After that, we have classes lined up for ancient history, economics, international relations, medieval history, science and tech, so on and so forth. So make sure that you attend all these classes. Again, it is 7 p.m. right here on our YouTube channel. Now let's see what are the topics that we'll be discussing today. From today's Hindu newspaper, we have taken up 3 topics for a detailed analysis. First, there is an article about the role of the Supreme Court and what should it do to kind of stop the government from making the laws which are not considered to be in favor of the country. And we'll discuss what that is. This is basically an article criticizing the government and an article which says that the Supreme Court must play a much more active role. The second topic is about consumption comparison between India and China. This article basically is filled up with a lot of data, graphs, analysis. It says that in India, at a private consumer level, we do not see a lot of consumption. Consumption, in fact, at a private consumer level in India is larger as compared to China. But overall consumption in China is higher. How? Because the Chinese government spends more money as compared to the Indian government. So it's a comparative analysis. How is it that while Indian consumer spends more money than China, why is it that we are still lagging and our growth is not up to the mark? Then the third topic is about Venus. Venus is extremely dry. Scientists have been trying to find out a reason about the excessive dryness on Venus. Why is it that it doesn't have water when it used to have so much water earlier? There's an article about that. Then from the prelims exam point of view, the first article is about parliamentary security. As you know, after a recent attack on the parliament, where some miscreants had entered the parliament with some spray cans, etc., the security in charge, or the security agency rather, for the parliament was changed. Now, CISF has been given the responsibility to look into the security of the parliament. We'll be looking into that. Then, an interesting tree, the baobab tree. It's a tree that all of you would recognize if you have watched some of these animated movies. It's a tree famous in Madagascar. There's an article on that, how this tree from Madagascar has now grown in Africa, also in Australia, and interestingly, in some parts of India also you do see this tree. And then the last article will be about the International Criminal Court, how there is a plea in the International Criminal Court that there should be arrest warrant against Netanyahu and also the Hamas leaders. So let's begin without any further ado. Let's begin with the first article. Now, before we analyze the first article, let me remind you quickly. These are editorials, means opinion pieces. In other words, the author is giving his or her opinion. You don't have to agree to it. So the author is writing from his own mind, from his own point of view. You might disagree with that. That is an entirely acceptable proposition here. You don't have to accept everything. So for example, the author here is making a point that the government in the past few years has been making a lot of laws targeted to a certain section of the society. And he says that this is wrong. He says that in such a situation, when the legislature does not understand their responsibility, when the legislature is not making inclusive laws, it becomes a responsibility of the judiciary then to come up and ensure that they put a stop on this. He says that the Supreme Court has not been doing this in the past, and he gives multiple examples. The first example, he gives is the Citizenship Amendment Act. Now, as you know, Citizenship Amendment Act very recently got implemented, rolled out on the ground, although it has been a few years since the law was passed. The government recently handed out the first few citizenship certificates also under this. The author points out something very interesting. Under this law, the Citizenship Amendment Act, how do you get citizenship? So those people who had entered India before 31st of December, now in this particular era, when you actually see who are these people 31st of December 2014 who actually entered India before this, they have to apply if they fall under a certain bracket, if they belong to specific religions, if they belong to specific countries, they have to apply for citizenship. Now the problem here is, in case when they apply for citizenship and their application is rejected, then what happens? The law is silent on that. When you are applying for citizenship under this law, means you are accepting that I came to India illegally. Because this law is specifically for those who came to India illegally or without any proper documentation before 31st December 2014. So when you are applying, that means you are accepting that I came illegally. So if you are not given citizenship, then what will happen to you? Because on one hand, you have accepted that I came illegally. On the second hand, you are not given citizenship. So now you become an illegal immigrant in India where you have identified yourself. The law is silent on that. The author gives an example of how the Supreme Court has been silent on this and they would have to take up a call on this matter soon. Generally, when the parliament makes a law, it is not automatically challenged in the court. When the parliament makes a law, it is considered to be valid automatically unless it is challenged in the court. So it is presumed that if the parliament has passed a law with a proper majority, following a proper procedure, it is a valid law. This is where the author says that the court has to be much more proactive. In the past, we have seen the government, again I am talking from the author's point of view. In the past, we have seen the government making a lot of very targeted legislation. And when you say targeted legislation, that means for one specific group or for one specific community, trying to interfere there. The author says that there have been multiple such examples of the law where the Supreme Court or the judiciary has not intervened. And even when they do intervene in the past, they intervene at such a stage that damage has already been done. The author says, for example, look at demonetization, look at removing the special status of Kashmir. Both of these matters were heard in the court, but so many years later that there was no point of it. Just a few months back, the court heard the matter on demonetization. And it's actually laughable. A few months back when the court was hearing the matter of demonetization, what would they have done? Even if they would have said demonetization was illegal, what was the use of it now? Everything was done already. Similarly, issue of the status of or the special status of Kashmir, Article 370 being taken away or diluted. When these matters are so urgent, as per the author, they have to be heard immediately by the Supreme Court, because the more you delay it, the more you are actually taking away any incentive of this matter being heard. And the Supreme Court, as per the author again, should be careful of the fact that even their own judgments are being overturned by the government. The example he gives here is the Election Commission of India. As you know, a few months back, it was the Election Commission of India's structure, appointment process that was changed by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said that there has to be a committee to suggest to the president who shall become the Election Commissioner of India. Supreme Court had suggested that the committee should have Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition and the Chief Justice of India. But the government then changed it. Government changed it to Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition and a Cabinet Minister of the Prime Minister's choice. Means, in other words, the Supreme Court's own judgment was actually kind of overturned, made ineffective by the government. The author says that the court should have said something, but they did not. That again indicates that maybe the government is being too heavy and the court is not realizing its true powers. These targeted legislations, another example that the author gives is about the triple talaq. Now, as you know, few years back the government of India criminalized triple talaq. Now, there are two ways to look at it. First, before the government made a law on criminalizing the practice of triple talaq, Supreme Court had already banned it. So, what was the need for the government to do it again? Number one. The difference between what the Supreme Court did and the government did was, while the Supreme Court banned it, saying that this should not be allowed, government on the other hand criminalized it. Means, government said that this will be considered as a criminal offense. You would be sent to jail if you follow this practice. That is again something that evoked a lot of reaction, because marriage is a civil agreement. And how do you criminalize that? But again, the government did that. Supreme Court did not say anything. These are the examples author is giving, that there have been targeted legislations. Supreme Court, as the safeguard of the rights of the people, has to ensure that it steps in, but they have not done so till now. In the past, it's not that Supreme Court has not done anything. There have been many interventions in the past that the Supreme Court has done very timely. For example, be it the 27% quota for the OBC in professional colleges, the Supreme Court put a stay order very quickly in 2007. Be it the farm laws, when these farm laws were being introduced, the Supreme Court very quickly again put a stay order on that. So it's not that Supreme Court can't do that. In fact, you will see the Supreme Court, High Court hearing some important matters involving important personalities at a very, very short notice. So if the excuse is that we have a long waiting, the point here is that you do hear cases without getting them or without asking them to wait for such a long time when you think that the cases are important. So why not do that here as well? This is the point that the author is making. At the end of the day, it depends on what the court believes. Now, in simple terms, what the author is trying to say, or the author is trying to suggest to the Supreme Court, is that they should follow or they should practice judicial activism. Now, I'm sure all of you are familiar with these phrases: judicial review, judicial activism, judicial overreach. Judicial review, simply speaking, the Supreme Court has this authority that if a law created by the Parliament or the state legislature is against the constitution's ultra-vires, the Supreme Court can strike it down. That is the power of judicial review that the Supreme Court has. The author says that the court must utilize this power much more actively. Then there are terms such as judicial activism and judicial overreach. These are kind of the two sides of the same coin, because depending upon which side you are on, you might categorize a decision of the court as activism or overreach. Judicial activism is when judiciary goes beyond its role and starts doing something that the government is supposed to do. It might be making a law, making a new law on its own. If you don't like that, if you think judiciary is overreaching, it's taking away the powers of the parliament, that can be called judicial overreach. So overreach and activism are kind of the same things. If you like what the Supreme Court is doing, you will call it activism, that see, such a great thing. For example, it was the Supreme Court that had given an order that in any movie theater, before the movie is played, national anthem should be played. People who liked it, they called it judicial activism. People who did not like it called it judicial overreach. So there's a very thin line between the two. It depends on which side you are sitting. If you're sitting on the side where you support the court, you will say judicial activism. If you don't support the court, it will automatically become judicial overreach. And this is where it gets slightly tricky. What about the Constitution of India? Does it give the power to the Supreme Court to ensure there is judicial review in our parliamentary system or in our judicial system? See, the words judicial review are not specifically mentioned. There are multiple places in our constitution where something like this has been signaled at, most specifically article number 13, that gives the power to Supreme Court to strike down laws or any order of the government that goes against the fundamental rights. So there are multiple articles, but none of them specifically mention the concept of judicial review, specifically mention the phrase judicial review. We have Article 372 that establishes judicial review as a prerequisite of the legislation. But again, the definition of it is left to the judiciary specifically. And this is where the judiciary has a free hand. Article 142 again plays a very key role here, which gives the power to Supreme Court to give any directive that will ensure complete justice in the society. Article 251, 254 says that any code or any law, in case of inconsistency between union and central government laws, the state law shall prevail. So again, all these articles talk about in which situation a law can be struck down, but again, the specific mention of judicial review is missing. Article 137, for example, gives the power to Supreme Court to review its own judgment as well in cases that have been given earlier. This is what the author is saying. Again, this is the author's point of view. This is what an editorial piece is. You might or might not agree with it. You can take the points where you agree, and it depends entirely upon you. Moving on to the second article for the day. Second article for the day is filled up with graphs, data, facts, and it is from economics. There's a comparative study done on consumption patterns in India and China. Now, let's take a very simple argument first. What are consumption patterns? Why are they important? Usually, it is believed that when a country wants to grow, it can grow in two of the very basic ways. First, it can grow on the basis of consumption, or it can grow on the basis of, let's say, export. Consumption means when the people within your country consume so much that it will automatically increase your growth. For example, let's say Indians buy so many things that our companies are happy to just sell within India. They don't have to sell anything outside. Foreign companies can also come and sell in India because they see such a high consumption pattern. So again, high consumption would mean a situation wherein you would be able to ensure that the people within the country are able to sustain their own economy, are able to sustain their own market. That is a consumption-driven economy. Usually, consumption-driven economy can only happen in high population countries. So, you need to have a high population in order to have a consumption-based economy. India, China, these can have very high consumption-based economies. But to have a consumption-based economy, you need to have high per capita income. Only when you have high income can you have high consumption. On the other hand, there are countries that focus on export, where their companies will make stuff, they will export, and that is how they will go. These are mainly two ways. In case of India, for a long time we believe that because our exports are not that high, maybe we can be held because of our consumption. So there is a comparative analysis done of consumption in India as compared to China. There's a lot of graphs and data sets here. So let's start with what exactly does this article tell you. The key highlight of this article is, although India has become the highest populated country in the world, we have overtaken China. But the fact is that in both these countries, India and China, the consumption power or the purchasing power of the people is not very high. Now, when you say consumption pattern or when you say people who are consuming, basically a consumer is considered as anyone who spends over $12 a day. So that is a definition. Do remember that. Anyone who spends over $12 a day will be called as a consumer. Those who are not spending money or spending money less than that will not be called as a consumer. The data suggests that India spends more on consumption as compared to China at a private or individual level. So at an individual level, an average Indian spends more than an average Chinese, usually for consuming things. It can be because things are costlier in India. It can be because we consume more. It can be because we are more outgoing, we eat out more, or we wear more clothes, etc. However, overall consumption, or when you say overall consumption, overall will be private or public consumption plus the government spending. Overall consumption of China is much higher as compared to India. So while private consumption of India is more than China, but overall consumption of China is more than India. Overall, 68% of GDP of China is their consumption expenditure, while 68% of the GDP of India is our consumption expenditure, while 53% is for China. Don't go in terms of percentage. When we say China's consumption more, we are talking about absolute terms. Because China's GDP is so much more that China's 53% of their GDP is obviously much bigger as compared to 68% of India. So this means that the government of China is spending much more money, while at the private level Indian consumer is spending more than China, but at the government level we are lagging behind the government of China. There are a lot of graphs that tell us about how the consumers are in India and China. For example, in India, there is a vast majority of poor and vulnerable consumers. The number of consumers that spend over $12 a day are much lesser as compared to that in China. Also, if you look at around the world, how is it that global consumer class has grown? Indian consumers have grown at the fastest pace, 29.5%, then Chinese consumers, then the rest of Asia. So basically when you say consumer growth means how many people are now spending more than $12 a day that are categorized as consumers. So India is a fast growing market. This also indicates, or this also proves why a lot of companies want to come to India and want to sell their products in India. Because all of them believe that India is a market where the people are now ready to spend much more money. Predictions suggest that India's consumers, the number of consumers will increase drastically. We are expecting a 46% growth from 2024 to reach till 2030. So again, India's consumption patterns will increase as the disposable income in your hand increases. As you're ready to spend more money, Indian consumer will become a much more attractive commodity for the companies around the entire world. Where do we spend most of our money? In India, most of our money is spent on food, tobacco and liquor. After that comes transportation and communication. Then we spend money on housing. Then we spend money on education, culture, recreation, etc. Now, some interesting parts here are, if you look at healthcare, the expenditure on healthcare is pretty low. In India, it should be higher. That indicates how the health system or health levels in India are not as high as it should be. As you can see in China, the overall expenditure of 2019 is much higher in most of these categories as compared to India. Now in India, how do we calculate these numbers? That is also important. How do we calculate how much expenditure is being done at the household level, at the consumer level? This is actually done every 5 years by NSO, National Statistical Office. It collects data about consumption patterns across the country, both in rural and in urban areas. That is how we calculate monthly per capita. How much consumption are you doing? How much expenditure do you have on food, non-food items, on services? For example, you buy clothes. How many times you go outside, or how much ration do you consume, how much petrol, diesel, etc. do you buy? All of that is taken into consideration. In the last survey that was done just a few months back, these were the key findings. If you see, our urban and rural, both these expenditure patterns are increasing. Interestingly, in rural areas, the consumption increased more as compared to urban areas in form of percentage. That is because they have a lower base. So obviously, because rural areas had a lower base, they used to spend lesser money. Any increase in them in the form of percentage will seem much higher. There is a shift in some patterns of consumption. For example, food expenditure decreased, and in households, etc. also. In rural households specifically, in urban households, both of them, the consumption or the expenditure on food decreased as compared to earlier. That is an important finding from this expenditure survey done by NSO. This is BVR Subramaniam, where he talked about some of these outputs. He is the Niti Aayog CEO. He talked about how there is a difference between rural and urban India, which is now narrowing. Earlier, rural India used to spend much lesser as compared to urban India. Now that difference is declining, which is again an important indicator, indicating that our rural growth or rural consumption patterns are increasing, which is a good thing, meaning that they have much more income that is disposable in their own hands. Next article we have from Science. It is about Venus. The simple theme of this article is, for a long time the scientists have been trying to see why is it that there is so much dryness on Venus. We expected that Venus would have more water as compared to what it has right now. There was a time millions of years ago when Venus had so much water on its surface that it could have an entire ocean 3 kilometers in depth. Now the amount of water on Venus is only for 3 centimeter deep ocean around its surface. Why is it that it has lost so much water? Why is it that so much water has evaporated? This is a question that many scientists around the world have been trying to answer. And now we do seem to have certain answers to that because of some scientists in the US. Usually there are 2 reasons that are considered for why Venus is so dry. First, obviously, it's much closer to the sun. So it's a very commonsensical assumption. When you look at the sun, first Mercury, then Venus. So it's obviously closer to the sun. The closer to the sun that you are, the more heat you will get, the more water will evaporate. So it's simple. That is the simple assumption. That planet's proximity to the sun, sun's heat, etc. will mean that there is more evaporation. There is one more reason. Other reason is the presence of high volume of carbon dioxide, CO2 on Venus. So Venus's atmosphere is made majorly of carbon dioxide. Now imagine, in our case, carbon dioxide is not even 1% of our atmosphere. And if it increases even slightly, we are so worried about global warming, we are so worried about greenhouse gases and their effect. Now in case of Venus, when majority of its atmosphere is made up of carbon dioxide only, that means the entire planet has a greenhouse effect. Its surface temperature is much hotter, not just because of sun, but because of carbon dioxide that traps all that heat. The temperature basically is about 450 degrees Celsius. That is why water usually can only exist in the form of vapor. So not just closeness to the sun, but also presence of so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These are the 2 reasons why Venus is usually believed to have lesser water. That is fine. But the question is, why it has evaporated so much so quickly? Scientists thought that water will evaporate, but at a slower pace. It should not evaporate at such a high pace where it did at Venus. And this is where a new discovery has come in. The new discovery suggests that there is a positively charged molecule called formylcation, HCO+. This is the one molecule that is behind why the Venus has dried up much quicker. It is something that drives out hydrogen on Mars as well. Basically, HCO plus dissociative recombination reaction means HCO plus DR. This is a reaction that occurs at about 125 kilometers in altitude, where the clouds are made up of sulfuric acid. This is something that actually leads to escaping of hydrogen on Mars. Something like this seems to have happened on Venus as well, just in the opposite direction. This HCO plus absorbs the electron and breaks up into carbon monoxide and hydrogen atom. Then these hydrogen atoms escape into the space. Researchers have found out that this reaction may have doubled the pace of loss of water due to hydrogen escape. Without hydrogen, you cannot have water. When you dissociate that, hydrogen escapes. That means you are not left with any water. And that is considered as a reason behind the fast or the quick pace at which Venus and its water has been evaporating. Anyways, we have had multiple missions to Venus from around the world. India is planning its own. It has been delayed slightly. US has already had a series of missions, including Pioneer Venus, Magellan. From Russia, we have Venera series, Vegas. From Japan, from Europe also we have had it. India is trying its own. It's called the Shukrayan 1. It has been delayed. Now the prospective date is 2031. But when you're so far away, you never know, it might be delayed even further. Right now, it's delayed till 2031, so not at the topmost priority. It's supposed to be an orbiter mission. Orbiters are easier than landers. It will not land, it will just orbit. It will have scientific payloads such as high resolution SAR and ground penetrating radar. It would examine the surface of the Venus, about the clouds around it, although it has very low visibility, but that is how the radars work. It will be able to penetrate the clouds and darkness. This reminds me of a very interesting interview where a very famous leader said that there are a lot of clouds, so let's take advantage of that. But please understand, radars can look beyond the clouds. Radars are not impacted by the clouds. Anyway, it will study Venus's geological and volcanic activity. It's supposed to be launched either on GSLV Mach 2 or Mach 3, or maybe by that time we have an even higher technology, even better launch vehicle. So far, this is the plan. It has been postponed till 2031. These are the three articles from the mains examination point of view. Now let's move on to the prelims exam point of view. We have three news stories. The first one about the Parliament's security unit. Now, Parliament has been at the center of some controversy regarding some security attacks. The major Parliament attack, terrorist attack that happened in 2001, we are not talking about that. A few months back, you saw some miscreants enter the Parliament with some spray cans, etc. Now, the Parliament has its own security. It's the Delhi police that looks into the Parliament security, and apart from that, Parliament has its own security called PSS, that is Parliament Security Service Unit. After the recent attack, it was thought that maybe they are not enough, and thus Parliament security has been handed over to CISF. CISF, as you know, the government agency that is responsible for securing our airports, for securing our important installations such as nuclear installations, etc. So CISF has been given the responsibility now to look into the Parliament security. Now the handover is happening, but when you hand over something like this, there's a lot of confusion. Confusion especially amongst the staff of Parliament Security Service. I'll give a very simple example. Parliament Security Service, when you are there for such a long time, let's assume this. Let's say there is a security in charge in an office. When you go to office every single day, first day, second day, maybe third day also, the security in charge will ask you for your identity card. You will show him. Fourth and fifth day, he will identify you. He will not stop you, right? That is how it usually works. Now the MPs are unhappy because now CISF is asking them every single day for their ID card. They say, we don't recognize you, have to show us your ID card. So the MPs are saying, oh, the old security was better, they recognized us. So these are some of the things that are happening right now. Obviously, national security is much, much higher than someone being irritated because they have to show the identity card. But to everyone is each own. Now, the security of the Parliament, as I said, is being gradually handed over to the CISF. It used to be with this unit called the Parliament Security Force. Now, Parliament Security Force was known by some other name earlier called the Watch and Ward Staff. Interestingly, it came into existence first after the famous bombing of this Legislative Assembly by Bhagat Singh and Batukeshwar Dutt. You would have read this in history. In 1929, they threw bombs and then they surrendered because they wanted to make their voices heard. They threw the bombs in the Central Legislative Assembly, that is the old Parliament building, also called the Samvidhan Sadan. After that, there was a need for this security. So this Watch and Ward Staff came up, and it was later renamed, very recently renamed to Parliament Security Service. They were renamed in 2008. State assemblies have their own kind of a security. They also have their own Watch and Ward Staff, usually taken from the police. So it's not the responsibility of the central government to give security to state legislatures. State legislatures have their own security guards. Now, system seems to be changing, at least in the Parliament level. As I told you, the Ministry of Home Affairs has given approval to CISF to survey and to now take over all the security. Delhi police has been discharged of its duty. The Parliament's own security has not been discharged, but they have taken a back seat now. Overall security of the Parliament is the responsibility of the Lok Sabha Secretariat. Do remember this fact as well. They are the ones responsible for looking over the security of the Parliament. What about the CISF? Very, very important force. It came into being in 1969 as a statutory body under the recommendation of Justice Mukherjee Commission. It is one of the 7 CAPF. CAPF exam, many people would be preparing for it. That Central Armed Police Force is the unit. It has 7 forces under it, including the BSF, ITBP, Sashastra Seema Bal, that is SSB, Assam Rifles, National Security Guards, and CRPF. All of them work under the Home Ministry. CISF, usually you see them at the airports. They are also responsible for handling nuclear installations and any important infrastructure of the Government of India. It's headed by the IPS officer of the rank of Director General. They also provide security to people from Z plus, Z, X and Y grade as well. It is one of those forces that has the highest or the largest percentage of women as compared to all other CAPF. So you will not see other armed police forces having so much representation of women as CISF has. Next interesting article about the baobab tree. Very, very interesting tree. You might have seen this tree in animated movies if you are fond of watching them. This is that tree. Very interesting structure, as you can see. It's also called as a mother of the forest. One of the reasons is that it stores a lot of water inside of it, which the species can use, and usually in the dry weather when there's a requirement, all this water can be utilized. It is a tree that is seen to be indigenous to Madagascar, very small island near Africa, but some of it is also grown in Africa and Australia. There have been a lot of mysteries around how the tree went from Madagascar to Africa to even Australia. The biggest assumption here is that the seeds of the tree might have floated on the ocean and over time would have reached Australia, over time would have reached Africa and other parts of the world. It's also called as the upside down tree. It's found, as I said, in Madagascar, parts of Africa, Australia. Interestingly, by the way, it is found in India as well. I'll tell you where exactly in India. It is one of those famous landmarks of Madagascar specifically. About 21 million years ago, they reached Africa and Australia as well, where the seeds would have floated around hundreds of years and they would have reached Australia eventually, Australian coast, and when they found suitable condition, they would have grown by themselves. It basically is located, or Madagascar, if you see, it's a very small island. If this is the southern coast of Africa, somewhere here you will see Madagascar. It's about 400 kilometers from the west, and from Australia it's about 7,000 kilometers. These trees are found in the savanna habitat. They provide food, shelter, so they have fruits also that can be eaten. Even their leaves are edible. They are also considered as a source of medicine by the local people. They are vulnerable to elephants in Africa specifically, because Africa has a lot of elephants, and there are many animals also that try to eat the trunk because there's water stored inside of it. So the animals can actually also try and eat it to get all that water that they want. What about in India? Interestingly, they are found in India as well, in Mandu. There's a place in 3rd district of Madhya Pradesh where they are found. Probably the only place in India where they are found in abundance. About 1,000 of these trees are seen here. Madhya Pradesh government has plans to apply for GI tag of Khorasani imli, that is the fruit that comes out from this tree. It is not called by the same name in Madagascar. Imli is an Indian variant of it, so we have given it this name. There's a tree near Golconda Fort in Andhra Pradesh as well, and this is something that is believed to be over 400 years old. Apart from Mandu, it's found in other areas as well, but again, when we say it's found in Mandu, means this is where it's found in large numbers, large quantity. In other places also you might find one or two, but 1,000 trees in one single place, that is only in Madhya Pradesh, 3rd district. The last article is about the International Criminal Court. There is a plea filed in the court that arrest warrant should be issued against the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the leaders of Hamas. Now, you all know, International Criminal Court is not affiliated to the UN. It's not a UN organ. So even if arrest warrant is issued, they don't have a force of their own that will go and arrest them. So it will not really have an impact. However, what happens is, when International Criminal Court issues an arrest warrant, what it means is that the countries that are members of this court, they would have the responsibility that if these people come to your country, you would have to arrest them. Nothing like this would happen. We also know it's been many months that Vladimir Putin was again, warrant was issued against Vladimir Putin. No one arrested him, and nothing will happen in this case as well. This plea has been filed by the special prosecutor in this court. It will now be heard by a panel of 3 judges who will decide on the case. Israel anyways is not a member. There will not be any arrest as such, but it might become slightly difficult for these people to travel abroad of the fear that maybe the other countries that are members of the ICC may arrest them, but actually speaking, it will not happen. Apart from that, Israel is facing other charges as well. South Africa, and we have discussed this many weeks back, South Africa has filed a case in the International Court of Justice, which is a UN judicial arm, accusing that what Israel is doing is genocide. That case is still going on. Please understand, International Court of Justice, ICJ, that is a UN organ. International Criminal Court is not a UN organ. So it's separate, it's not the same. It is very recent. International Criminal Court came into being in 2002 only. The idea was to look into war crimes of individuals, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression. UN is not controlling authority of the ICC. The UN has endorsed ICC, it supports it, but the court is independent of its own. The problem is that this court does not have any mechanism through which it can impose or implement its own judgments. Interestingly, in 2015, the state of Palestine was accepted as a member of this particular court. Palestine has also accepted the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court. Here are a few things that you should know about this. It came into being as a result of the Rome Statute that has been accepted or adopted by 120 countries. It has been ratified by 60 states by 2002, that is when it came into force. It does not have any retrospective jurisdiction, means any war crime that took place before 2002 are not covered under this. It also sets new standards for victim representation in the courtroom. Again, it's kind of a platform where the victims can go and hope that their voices will be heard, but there is no implementation authority, and that is where it lacks most of its powers. Here are a few other facts. It right now has about 900 staff members. There are 6 official languages recognized in the court. It has 2 working languages, English and French, and its headquarters is in The Hague, the Netherlands. It has 6 field offices. Most of them, as you can see, are in Africa itself, because this is where most of these conflicts usually have taken place. This brings us to the end of the topics of discussion. Here are a couple of practice questions. Do try and write answers to these. First one is about China and India consumption patterns. How are they interpreted? What is the exact consequence of Indian consumption, overall consumption being lesser than China? And second question is, this is a statement actually that was given by Prashant Bhushan recently. So in case you are trying to write the answer, Prashant Bhushan, the famous Supreme Court lawyer, gave the statement, so try and write this. This brings me to the end of this class. I hope you learned something new. Do join us tomorrow as well at 10 a.m. for the next session of the Hindu Newspaper Analysis. Till then, bye-bye. Jai Hind.